Con 8 cámaras térmicas.
The storm had been relentless. I'd driven for hours through torrents of rain that blurred the headlights and turned the road into a shimmering river of black. The windshield wipers could barely keep up, and each rumble of thunder felt like a warning from nature itself. I was exhausted and desperate for a break when I spotted the diner's neon sign flickering through the downpour. I pulled into the gravel parking lot, tires crunching over the loose stones. The diner's sign, an old-fashioned neon eat with a jagged flicker, buzzed weakly. It wasn't the most inviting sight, but it was better than driving another mile in this storm. I stepped out of my truck and hurried toward the entrance, my shoes sloshing in the puddles that formed around my feet. The storm battered the diner's exterior, rattling the window panes and making the sign flicker sporadically, casting erratic shadows on the wet pavement. Inside, the warmth was a welcome relief. The diner's interior was a relic from another era. Red vinyl booths, chrome accents, and a jukebox in the corner that seemed to have seen better days. The smell of coffee and fried food hung in the air, oddly comforting after the cold and wet outside. A bell jingled as I opened the door, and the staff, 2 waitresses and a cook, looked up from behind the counter. Their smiles were polite but seemed practiced, as if they were used to dealing with weary travelers. One of the waitresses, a middle-aged woman with a frizzy apron and glasses perched on her nose, gave me a nod. "Evening," she said, her voice muffled by the storm outside. "What can I get for you?" "Just something warm," I replied, shuffling to a booth near the window. I needed to get out of my damp clothes and dry off. As I slid into the booth, the rain continued to hammer against the glass, creating a steady, drumming rhythm. The jukebox, which had been silent, sputtered to life with a scratchy tune from decades past. The dim, yellow light from the neon sign outside cast a sickly glow across the room, making the whole place feel oddly surreal. I glanced around, noting the vintage decor, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The waitress returned with a steaming cup of coffee and a plate of fries, her footsteps echoing slightly in the otherwise quiet diner. "Here you go. Let me know if you need anything else." "Thanks," I said, taking the coffee and sipping it gratefully. The heat from the drink seeped into my chilled bones, and I relaxed slightly. As I ate, I noticed the other waitress and the cook occasionally glancing at me with what seemed like an odd mixture of curiosity and caution. Maybe it was just the isolation of the storm or the long drive, but the atmosphere in the diner felt heavier than it should have. I shook off the feeling, focusing on the warmth of the coffee and the comforting familiarity of the diner. But as I looked out the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from beyond the storm's veil, something I couldn't quite see or understand. The flickering neon sign seemed to pulse in rhythm with the growing unease that gnawed at my nerves. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, wind howling and rain lashing against the diner's windows. The lights flickered occasionally, and the power briefly wavered, making the whole place feel even more isolated. I leaned back in the booth, trying to relax, but a strange sense of discomfort gnawed at me. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed the waitresses, Judy, according to her name tag, and a younger woman named Carol, moving about the diner. They refilled a couple of salt shakers and checked the coffee pots, performing their tasks with mechanical precision. Something about their movements seemed too synchronized, too practiced, as if they were following an unseen script. "Do you get many travelers through here?" I asked Judy when she came over to check on me. The question seemed innocent enough, but the way her eyes darted to the side before she answered made me uneasy. "Not many," she said with a tight smile. "Mostly regulars and the occasional trucker, like yourself." There was something off about her smile. It felt forced, almost like a mask. I shrugged it off, attributing it to fatigue or the strangeness of the night. I returned to my fries, the once comforting smell now feeling slightly nauseating. As I ate, I noticed another figure in the corner of the diner, an older man in a worn-out jacket, sitting alone with a half-finished plate of eggs and bacon. His eyes were fixed on his food, but he seemed tense, shoulders hunched and eyes flicking toward the door every so often. I hadn't seen him when I first walked in. Had he been there all along? The diner was almost eerily quiet except for the occasional clatter of dishes and the low hum of the jukebox playing a melancholic tune. The whole scene felt like it was stuck in time, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. I turned my attention back to the window, the rain still pouring down. The neon sign outside buzzed faintly, casting odd shadows that seemed to dance along the wet pavement. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the parking lot, just beyond the reach of the light. I blinked, and the figure was gone, replaced by the darkness of the storm. Shaking my head, I tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light. The storm was playing with my mind, making me see things that weren't there. But the uneasy feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing minute. Carol approached my booth, carrying a fresh pot of coffee. "Need a refill?" she asked, her tone overly cheerful. I nodded, and she poured the dark liquid into my cup, the steam rising between us. As she walked away, I caught a glimpse of something strange. Her reflection in the window seemed to linger a moment longer than it should have, almost as if it were watching me. I quickly turned my head to look at her, but she was already back behind the counter, chatting quietly with Judy. The reflection was gone. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Something was definitely wrong here, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The atmosphere had shifted from mildly uncomfortable to distinctly unsettling. Deciding it was time to leave, I reached into my pocket for some cash to pay for the meal. Just as I was about to stand up, the door to the diner opened with a creak, and a blast of cold air swept in. A man walked in, drenched from the rain, but what caught my attention was the expression on his face, a mix of confusion and fear. He looked around, his eyes locking onto me for a moment. There was something unsettlingly familiar about him. Before I could place it, he turned and made his way to the counter, where Judy greeted him with that same tight, unnatural smile. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen him before, maybe in the mirror, maybe in a dream. My heart pounded in my chest as a nagging thought took root in my mind. What if I wasn't the only one noticing these oddities? What if this stranger was experiencing the same creeping dread? As I sat there, frozen in my seat, I couldn't help but wonder, what the hell was going on in this diner? And why did everything feel so wrong? The storm outside felt like a wall, trapping me in this eerie, unsettling place with no way out. The diner was starting to feel like a trap. The storm outside raged on, but inside the atmosphere was thick with an unsettling calm. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I watched as Judy, Carol, and the other staff moved around the diner, their movements increasingly synchronized. It was as if they were part of a choreographed routine. The oddness of their behavior grew more apparent with each passing minute. They spoke in hushed tones, exchanged glances that seemed to convey messages I couldn't decipher, and moved with a precision that felt too perfect. When I glanced up at the clock on the wall, I noticed it wasn't working properly. The hands seemed to skip backward and forward, as though the passage of time was distorted. It was disorienting, making me feel as though I was trapped in a loop. The jukebox, which had been playing softly in the background, suddenly sputtered and went silent. A few moments later, it crackled back to life, but the song was different, more discordant and eerie. The familiar hum of the diner's appliances seemed to grow louder, more oppressive. A shiver ran down my spine as I noticed that the people around me were acting strangely. A man at the counter was talking loudly to himself, gesturing wildly with a fork as he ate. His behavior was erratic, and the way his eyes darted around made me uneasy. I glanced at the other patrons and saw that they, too, were behaving oddly, their actions erratic and their expressions vacant. I tried to shake off the growing sense of paranoia. Maybe it was just the isolation and the storm getting to me. I decided to focus on finishing my meal and then leave. But my attempts at normalcy were constantly interrupted by the bizarre behavior around me. As I reached for a napkin, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. The man at the counter was now staring directly at me. His eyes were wide, and there was something unsettlingly familiar about his gaze. It was as if he knew something I didn't, or worse, he was trying to communicate something through that blank, penetrating stare. The moment was interrupted when Carol approached my booth with a fresh pot of coffee. She poured it with a forced cheerfulness that didn't reach her eyes. "Everything all right?" she asked, her voice too bright, too rehearsed. "Yeah, just a bit tired," I replied, forcing a smile. I didn't trust my voice not to betray the anxiety I was feeling. As Carol walked away, I noticed the man at the counter standing up abruptly. He seemed to be looking for something, or someone. His movements were erratic, and he bumped into a nearby table, sending a glass shattering to the floor. The noise echoed through the diner, but no one seemed particularly startled. I felt a prickle of fear. I wasn't alone in feeling this way. I was surrounded by people, or creatures, that were just as confused and frightened as I was. The realization struck me like a punch to the gut. The strange behavior, the unsettling atmosphere, it was all part of something much larger and more sinister. Trying to ignore the growing sense of dread, I glanced out the window. The rain was still coming down hard, and the wind howled through the empty parking lot. I noticed that the neon sign outside seemed to be malfunctioning more severely now, its flickering light casting strange shadows that danced and twisted in ways that made my skin crawl. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned my attention back to the diner's interior. The staff and patrons continued their strange, synchronized routines, their eyes occasionally flicking toward me with an unsettling intensity. It was as if they were waiting for something, and I was the only one who hadn't yet figured out what that something was. As I sat there trying to piece together the fragments of my disjointed thoughts, I couldn't help but feel that time was slipping away from me. The diner, once a refuge from the storm, was now a place of growing menace. The sense of entrapment grew stronger, and the reality of my situation started to sink in. I knew I had to leave. The storm outside was no longer the only thing keeping me here. The true danger lay within these walls, and I was running out of time to escape it. The sensation of being watched was inescapable. Every time I glanced around, it felt like eyes were following me. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, but the strange behavior of the diner's staff and patrons was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The once cozy booths and counter stools now seemed more like cages. The walls appeared to close in, and the once familiar diner layout started to feel like a maze. I noticed that the diner's decor was shifting subtly. The red vinyl booths now looked more faded and cracked, and the chrome accents had an unsettling, almost organic sheen to them. I decided to take a walk around the diner, hoping to clear my mind and regain some sense of normalcy. As I passed by a row of booths, I saw the faces of the patrons staring at me with vacant eyes. They were all identical, features eerily similar, as though they were copies of each other. It was an unsettling realization, and I had to suppress a shiver. The staff, too, were becoming increasingly unnerving. Judy and Carol moved with a disconcerting synchronization, their actions too precise, too deliberate. It was as if they were performing a dance that I wasn't a part of. When I tried to catch their eyes, they seemed to avert their gaze quickly, their smiles now forced and unsettling. My attempts to find an exit were futile. The door I had used to enter was now blocked by a pile of old, rusting kitchen equipment. The windows, which had once offered a view of the storm, were now opaque and covered in a thick layer of grime that distorted the outside world. I tried the diner's back rooms, hoping to find a service entrance or a way out. The narrow hallway was dimly lit, the flickering bulbs casting long, menacing shadows. The sound of the storm outside seemed to grow louder, mixing with the eerie silence of the diner. Each step I took echoed off the walls, amplifying my growing sense of dread. I stumbled into a storage room filled with dusty shelves and old boxes. As I turned to leave, I saw a strange sight. a mirror on the wall, but it didn't reflect the room as it was. Instead, it showed an image of the diner that was somehow different, more distorted, more sinister. The reflections of the staff and patrons in the mirror moved in ways that didn't match their real-life counterparts. I jumped back in shock, my heart racing. I could feel a cold sweat forming on my brow. The mirror's reflection seemed to twist and distort, the figures inside now showing grotesque, mocking versions of the people I had seen earlier. Their smiles were twisted, their eyes hollow and menacing. Desperate to understand what was happening, I tried to confront the staff. I approached Judy, who was wiping down a table with a rag that seemed to have never been cleaned. Her smile was a tight mask, her eyes flicking toward me with an unsettling intensity. "Is everything all right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm starting to feel like something's not right here." Her smile faltered for a brief moment before she responded in a forced, cheerful tone. "Everything's fine. Just a bit of a storm, that's all. We're here to make sure you're comfortable." The response felt rehearsed, as though she were reading from a script. I looked around the diner again, the growing realization that the normalcy I had once taken for granted was slipping away. The atmosphere was thick with an oppressive sense of foreboding, and I felt as if I was being drawn into a web of paranoia and fear. Returning to my booth, I glanced out the window again. The storm outside had grown even more violent, with lightning flashing and thunder crashing in the distance. The neon sign flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The diner, once a refuge from the storm, was now the storm itself, a chaotic, menacing place that defied all logic and reason. I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making, and the sense of impending danger grew stronger with each passing minute. My thoughts raced as I tried to come up with a plan. I needed to escape, but every attempt seemed to lead me deeper into the diner's labyrinthine interior. The more I tried to understand what was happening, the more I realized that there was no escaping the horror that was slowly unfolding around me. The realization was chilling. I was not alone in my fear. The diner's dark secrets were beginning to reveal themselves, and the true horror was only just beginning to surface. The air in the diner felt thick and oppressive, pressing down on me with a weight that made it hard to breathe. I sat back in my booth trying to gather my thoughts, but my mind was a storm of confusion and fear. The strange behavior of the staff and patrons, the distorted reflections, the blocked exits, none of it made sense, yet it all felt disturbingly real. As I sat there, the sounds of the diner seemed to blur together into an indistinct murmur. The clinking of silverware, the soft hum of the overhead lights, the faint buzz of the jukebox, it all felt distant, as if I were underwater, struggling to stay afloat. My senses felt dulled, but my awareness of the creeping danger around me was sharp and painfully clear. I glanced around, trying to focus. The other patrons were still behaving oddly, their movements stiff and unnatural. The same vacant expressions, the same synchronized gestures. It was like watching a group of mannequins pretending to be human. My eyes settled on the man who had been talking to himself earlier. He was now staring blankly at his plate, his mouth moving in silent conversation with no one. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and for a split second, everything went dark. When the lights came back on, I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. The man was still in his seat, but his appearance had changed. His eyes were now wide open, unblinking, and his skin had taken on a waxy, pale tone. It was as if he had been replaced with a lifeless doll, a hollow shell of the person who had been there moments before. I looked around frantically, my heart racing. The other patrons were similarly affected. Stiff, lifeless, their eyes glassy and fixed on some unseen point. It was as if the diner had become a gallery of eerie, lifeless figures, each one frozen in time. The only movement came from the staff, who continued their tasks with the same unsettling precision as before. Panic gripped me, and I knew I had to get out of there. I stood up, intending to make a break for the door, but something caught my eye. A reflection in the window, my own reflection, seemed to move differently from me. I turned to face the window, and what I saw made my blood run cold. In the glass, my reflection stared back at me, but its expression was twisted, a grotesque mockery of my own fear. The eyes were dark and empty, and the mouth was stretched into a sinister, unnatural grin. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the reflection was not mimicking my actions. It was moving on its own, reaching out towards me with clawed hands. I stumbled back, crashing into a nearby table. The sudden noise drew the attention of the staff, who all turned to look at me in unison. Their faces were blank, but there was something predatory in the way they moved, slowly closing in on me. Desperate, I backed away, my eyes darting around for an escape. The exits were still blocked, and the windows were now completely opaque, as if covered in a thick, impenetrable fog. I was trapped, and the sense of impending doom was overwhelming. Just then, Judy stepped forward, her expression finally breaking into something that resembled emotion, a cold, calculating smile. "You can't leave," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "Not until you've finished your meal." The absurdity of the statement would have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. I glanced at my plate, still untouched, and then back at Judy. Her eyes were locked onto mine, unblinking, and I felt a surge of terror unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was then that I saw them. The copies. They emerged from behind the counter, from the kitchen, from the shadows. Identical to the staff and patrons, but with twisted, inhuman features. Their eyes were dark voids, their mouths twisted into grotesque grins. They moved in perfect unison, advancing toward me with a single-minded purpose. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the tiled floor. The diner seemed to stretch endlessly before me, the walls closing in. The lights flickered again, casting eerie, shifting shadows that seemed to reach out and grab at me. I could hear the creatures behind me, their footsteps a soft, that relentless echo of my own. I stumbled into the hallway leading to the bathrooms and the storage rooms, my heart racing. The air was colder here, the lights dimmer. I could hear the faint, distorted sound of the jukebox still playing, the melody twisted and warped. The sound of my own breathing filled my ears, loud and ragged. I ducked into the storage room, slamming the door behind me. The darkness was suffocating, and I felt along the wall for a light switch. When the lights flickered on, I saw them again, the creatures reflected in the mirror on the opposite wall. They were closer now, their twisted faces leering at me through the glass. But when I turned to look behind me, the room was empty. Terror gripped me as I realized the reflections were not mere illusions. They were coming for me, closing in through the mirrors, the glass, the very fabric of the diner. There was no escape. I was trapped in this nightmare, surrounded by these monstrous doppelgangers, their presence suffocating and inescapable. I had to think fast. There had to be a way out, a way to escape this waking nightmare. But with every passing second, the walls seemed to close in and the air grew colder. The terror was overwhelming, and I could feel the last vestiges of hope slipping away. As I stood there, frozen in fear, I heard a faint, distant voice, my own voice coming from somewhere beyond the mirrors. It was calling out, desperate and pleading. I realized with a start that it was a recording, a twisted echo of my own fear and despair. The copies were taunting me, using my own voice to drive me further into panic. I had to escape, but how? The diner was a maze, the exits blocked, the reflections closing in. And the worst part was, I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The boundaries between reality and nightmare were blurring, and I was losing myself in the darkness. But I couldn't give up. I had to find a way out, a way to break free from this twisted, horrifying place. My mind raced, searching for a solution, for anything that could help me escape the nightmare that the diner had become. And all the while, the creatures watched, their hollow eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. My heart pounded as the feeling of being watched grew more intense. The once cozy diner was now an alien, oppressive maze. As I stood in the main dining area, the fluorescent lights above flickered ominously, casting distorted shadows across the room. My eyes darted from face to face, trying to distinguish between real people and their monstrous copies. The line between reality and nightmare blurred with each passing moment. I took a step back, feeling the cool, sticky tile underfoot. The patrons and staff who had been eerily still now moved with a disconcerting synchronicity. The copies, those twisted, grotesque versions of the people I knew, were becoming more apparent. Their eyes, void of any warmth or humanity, followed my every move. It was as if they were waiting for something, a signal to pounce. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently before plunging the diner into near darkness. The jukebox at the far end of the room crackled to life, playing a warped, haunting tune that echoed through the oppressive silence. Panic surged through me, and I knew I had to move. I bolted towards the kitchen, my breath ragged. The swinging door crashed behind me, and I skidded to a halt amidst the clattering of pots and pans. The kitchen, usually a bustling hub of activity, was deserted. The stainless steel surfaces gleamed under the dim emergency lights, and every reflective surface seemed to show a different, nightmarish reality. As I rushed past the prep stations, I glanced at the metal surfaces and caught fleeting glimpses of the copies, moving in unnatural, jerky motions, their eyes fixed on me. They seemed to emerge from the reflections themselves, stepping out of the shiny metal counters and utensils like specters. The air felt thick with their presence, a suffocating blanket of malevolence. I yanked open the walk-in freezer, hoping to find a momentary refuge. The cold air hit me like a wall, and I shivered, both from the temperature and the sheer terror gripping me. I leaned against the metal shelves, trying to steady my breathing. But it was no use. The fear was overwhelming. From the crack in the freezer door, I could see the kitchen beyond. The shadows shifted, and I caught sight of them. Copies of the staff, now moving with a predatory grace, as if they'd shed their human pretense. They were coming, and I had nowhere to hide. The air grew colder, and I felt the chill seeping into my bones. My breath fogged up the small window, obscuring my view of the outside. Suddenly, the door to the freezer swung open with a creak. I turned, heart racing, to see one of the copies standing in the doorway, its distorted smile stretching impossibly wide. It tilted its head, eyes locking onto mine. The fear that had been simmering inside me exploded into full-blown panic. I dashed past it, barely avoiding its outstretched arms. The cold from the freezer clung to me as I stumbled back into the kitchen. The jukebox's eerie melody echoed louder, a dissonant soundtrack to my frantic escape. I pushed through the swinging door back into the dining area, my eyes scanning for any possible way out. To my horror, the dining room was now filled with the copies. They stood in unison, their gazes fixed on me. The real patrons and staff were nowhere to be seen, replaced entirely by these horrifying doppelgangers. The air felt thick with a sense of impending doom, and I could hear my own heartbeat, a deafening drum in my ears. The only exit was the front door, but as I made a desperate dash for it, I saw the copies closing in, their movements eerily synchronized. They reached out towards me, their hands like claws ready to drag me back into the nightmare. I skidded to a halt, realizing that escape through the front was impossible. In a last-ditch effort, I turned and bolted for the counter. The diner had become a labyrinth of tables and chairs, all seemingly rearranged to trap me. I vaulted over the counter, landing hard on the linoleum floor behind it. The creatures surged forward, their grins widening, eyes glinting with a predatory hunger. I spotted a small door behind the counter, one I'd never noticed before. It was marked Office, and it seemed like my only option. With the copies hot on my heels, I scrambled towards it, flinging the door open and slamming it shut behind me. The office was small and cramped, filled with filing cabinets and old paperwork. A single flickering light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting an anemic glow. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. I could hear the muffled sounds of the copies outside, their voices a chilling cacophony that sent shivers down my spine. I knew I couldn't stay here. They would find a way in, and then it would be over. I needed a plan, a way out of this nightmare. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could help. A small, barred window caught my eye, offering a glimpse of the dark alley outside. With trembling hands, I moved a filing cabinet over to the window, climbing up to peer outside. The alley was narrow and dark, but it was a possible escape route. I gripped the bars, testing their strength, and felt a surge of hopelessness. They were sturdy, firmly attached to the wall. Desperation clawed at me as I heard the door behind me creak. The copies were getting closer, their footsteps growing louder. The room felt like it was closing in, the air thick with fear and the scent of musty paper. I glanced around one last time, spotting a rusty pipe running along the ceiling. An idea formed, a risky, desperate idea, but it was all I had. I grabbed a chair, positioning it beneath the pipe, and climbed up. With a deep breath, I reached for the pipe, hoping it would hold my weight. The pipe groaned, but it held. I shimmied along it, my hands slick with sweat. The door below me burst open, and the copies flooded into the room, their eyes scanning for me. I held my breath, pressing myself against the ceiling, praying they wouldn't look up. The room was filled with their eerie, distorted laughter, a sound that chilled me to the core. They moved around the room, searching, but for a moment they seemed confused, unable to locate me. My heart raced, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, one of the copies pointed towards the ceiling, and they all looked up. Our eyes met, and in that instant I felt a cold wave of terror. They knew where I was, and there was no escape. I braced myself, knowing the end was near. But then, a loud crash echoed from the diner outside, drawing their attention. The copies turned, hesitating for a moment before moving towards the sound. It was a stroke of luck, a brief reprieve, and I knew I had to act fast. As soon as they left the room, I scrambled down from the pipe, landing awkwardly on the floor. My legs were shaking, but I forced myself to move. The copies were distracted, and this was my chance. I bolted out of the office, heading for the front door, hoping against hope that it would be my way out. The front door of the diner creaked open, and I stumbled into the stormy night. The rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, but the wind howled, whipping the damp air against my face. My clothes were drenched, clinging to my skin, but the chilling rain was nothing compared to the fear that still gripped me. I glanced back at the diner, the lights flickering ominously through the glass. The creatures inside were still hunting me, their twisted forms visible through the raindrops on the window. I was momentarily blinded by the rain and the harsh, biting wind, and I took off down the alley, desperate to put distance between myself and the horror behind me. The alley was narrow and dark, the buildings on either side looming like silent, oppressive sentinels. The alley twisted and turned, becoming a labyrinth of shadows and damp stone. Every corner seemed to hide another threat, another possible trap. I could hear the distant rumble of thunder and the occasional crackle of lightning illuminating the sky. The diner's lights seemed to flicker intermittently, casting ghostly reflections on the wet pavement. I spotted a door at the end of the alley, an emergency exit for one of the adjacent buildings. With no other options in sight, I sprinted towards it, my shoes slipping on the wet ground. The door was locked, but I gave it a desperate shove, my heart sinking as I realized it wouldn't budge. Frustrated, I pounded on it with my fists, hoping for a miracle. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, growing louder and more insistent. The copies were getting closer. I had to keep moving. I turned and ran further into the alley, searching for another way out. The sense of urgency was overwhelming. I could feel the cold sweat of fear mingling with the rain on my skin. As I turned a corner, I saw a fire escape ladder attached to one of the buildings. It was a risky move, but it was my only chance. I scrambled up the ladder, my hands slipping on the wet rungs, but I managed to pull myself up to the second floor. I reached the landing and pushed open a window, stepping into a darkened room. It was an old storage area, filled with dusty boxes and abandoned furniture. The room smelled musty, and the air was stale. I took a moment to catch my breath, but the sense of safety was fleeting. The sound of the copies' footsteps was faint, but growing louder, their relentless pursuit unyielding. I crept to the window and peered outside. The alley below was still dark and empty, but I knew they wouldn't be far behind. My escape route had to be quick and decisive. I noticed a narrow, poorly lit corridor leading out of the storage room. It seemed to lead to the building's front, possibly giving me access to a street where I might find more chances for escape. Moving cautiously, I made my way down the corridor. The building's interior was a confusing maze of hallways and staircases. Every step felt like a potential misstep, and every sound made me flinch. The walls seemed to close in on me, the low, flickering lights casting distorted shadows that played tricks on my mind. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the hallway. I froze, my heart pounding. The copies had found their way into the building. Panic surged through me, and I quickened my pace, hoping to reach the front entrance before they caught up. As I rounded a corner, I spotted the building's front door, an old wooden door with a small glass window. I could see the street outside, bathed in the harsh light of street lamps. It was a glimpse of freedom, but I had to get there before the copies did. With a final burst of speed, I dashed towards the door. I could hear the unmistakable sound of their footsteps growing closer, echoing down the hallway. My breath was coming in ragged gasps and my legs felt like lead. The door was locked, and I fumbled with the keypad, trying to enter the access code. The door creaked open just as the copies emerged from the shadows, their grotesque faces illuminated by the dim light. I barely had time to react. I threw myself through the door and out into the street, slamming it shut behind me. The copies pounded against the door, their distorted voices a chilling reminder of the horror still lurking inside. I stumbled onto the street, drenched and exhausted, but a glimmer of hope sparked within me. I was free from the immediate threat of the diner, but I knew the danger wasn't over. The copies had followed me into the building, and their influence might still linger. As I walked down the street, my mind raced with the knowledge that the nightmare wasn't truly over. I had escaped the diner, but the terror of the copies and the twisted reality they had created was still fresh in my mind. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a slick, reflective surface on the pavement. The street was eerily quiet, the occasional rumble of thunder the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. I kept moving, my eyes scanning for any sign of danger. I was exhausted, my body trembling from the cold and fear. I knew I had to find somewhere safe, somewhere I could regroup and figure out what to do next. The diner might be behind me, but the echoes of its horror would stay with me for a long time. As I continued down the street, the city lights flickered in the distance, offering a faint sense of normalcy amidst the chaos. I took one last look back at the darkened street, the eerie glow of the diner's sign still visible in the distance. The nightmare had not truly ended, but I had taken the first step towards escaping it. With each step, I moved further away from the diner's grasp, but the lingering fear remained, a reminder of the terror I had narrowly escaped.